Hearty shalom to you, Jeffrey Seif here. I'm glad you're there. I say that all the time, and I mean it every time I say it, that we're so pleased in the Tree of Life Society to have friends, that you care. So we're in the 26th chapter. I want to look at verses 24 through 32. That gets us to the end of the chapter, and as you might recall from the last, Paul is standing up and offering an accounting for himself in front of Festus. And Festus makes a comment in verse 24. He, in effect, interrupts and very forcefully says, "You're crazy. Your great learning is driving you insane." Well, Paul was a lettered individual. Elsewhere he'll say, that, I'm just a simple country preacher. In the Corinthian correspondences, I just preach Jesus, Yeshua, and him crucified, and that's that. He represents himself as simple. Well, his message is rather simple and very direct, but he himself is not a simple man. He's complex, and the others were farmers and fishermen, but Paul actually was an educated fellow, and that comes through in the way that he communicates. And I think it's interesting, Festus is this is madness. And at one level it is, when you think about the gospel story about someone who was killed and came back to life, who then offers life to those who were living in death. It is, I understand why Paul would say it's folly to those who are perishing, but this whole exchange about for sinners consigned to death is new life through blood sacrifice is perfectly consistent with the Hebrew Bible. It's not consistent with modern Judaism, because modern Judaism isn't the Judaism of Moses, if you will, where it's based in a tabernacle and there's a priesthood offering sacrifices. There's no tabernacle today. There's no priesthood. There are rabbis. There's no sacrifices. There's speeches. And it's a different kind of arrangement. I'm not looking to disparage it, just to say it's different. And the notion of someone dying in order that people can have life is consistent with Moses. Paul declares, "I'm not insane, most noble Festus." He himself is respectful. "Rather, I am speaking the sober truth. For the king knows these things, and I speak freely to him, since I'm convinced that none of these things escape his notice. For this was not done in a corner." It's an interesting statement. Jesus made his entrance onto the stage of the human drama, and he ministered openly. His signs and wonders testified to the veracity, to the truthfulness of his message, and that and the force of his persona commended itself to populations. And it's because of what was generated, both pro and con. Pro, the reason why Paul's jacked up by the police is there's a movement against the movement. That is to say, there is a movement of Jews who've accepted Yeshua to the chagrin of religious authorities that weren't minded to go that direction. And he says, listen, this stuff, I'm sure you're aware of this. It is recorded. It is noted in the sources. He says then in verse 27, "King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets?" I know that you believe. Raises another issue. That is that the notion of a suffering Messiah is attested in the prophets. The testimony in the Gospels is that these disciples were instructed in the law and the prophets and the Psalms, things concerning the Messiah. And he says, do you believe this? The genesis of this is, you're crazy. The response to that is, this is the biblical testimony in the Hebrew Bible. Agrippa says, in a short time, are you trying to persuade me to be messianic? It's a reasonable question. And of course, the answer is yes. Paul says, listen, I wish that all men would, save for these chains. And it's a great response. It's a great exchange. And it gives a window into Paul. He just doesn't back down on it. He just doesn't succumb to the pressure. He is himself. And, I think that's so important. We've had an experience with the Lord. Paul shares his experience. He's on the road to Damascus. He's knocked off his horse. He hears the word. He sees a vision. Paul, why are you persecuting me? Hands are laid on him. His sight is restored. That's his story. And Paul is not backing down from his story. It's not just, commending doctrine to the world. It's his experience with the risen Savior. And this is my story. This is my song, praising the Savior all the day long, to quote a modern hymn. Well, a hymn that's still around in modernity. So he is that. And let me encourage you, don't let forces talk you into being something other than that. For a season, for me, I kind of had drifted away from the Lord and was particularly game to want to be accepted in the Jewish world. I realized that because I've accepted Yeshua, Jesus. It created certain tensions. So I had moved to another city and gotten involved in the synagogue a little bit. But for me, I decided that I was being disingenuous. That is to say, with whatever problems I had. In my case, I was single at the time, and I was kind of discouraged, and I just said, well, I'm tired of being a monk and want to get out there and live again and love again and all that. And it seemed to be coming too slow. Well, subsequent to all that, I had 30 years of marriage to my first wife, Patty. May she rest in peace, and I'm happily married now. But I kind of had a problem, and I wanted just to run away from the gospel people, and I wanted to distance myself from the gospel message. And for me, I realized that I just wasn't being true to me. That is to say, I have had a regenerating experience with the Lord, as I understand it. It's not as dramatic as Paul on the road to Damascus, but nevertheless, it's personalized and it's internalized to me. And I want to live consistent with that, because that's me being consistent with me. Well, in the wake of this exchange, and this is just an adumbration, a rough sketch of it, the powers give voice and say, listen, this man's done nothing deserving of death or chains. But he appealed to Caesar, Agrippa says to Festus, so to Caesar he will go. And then off he goes in the next chapter. We'll get to it the next talk. He sets his sights toward Rome. We're in Caesarea right now. It's a maritime port there, a major port, by the way, and he's going to get a boat out and make his way to Rome, to the next stop on the road. And we're following this man in his journey. I hope you're picking up some things that you can use in your own journey, even as you were gracious to let me pontificate a tad bit about this passage. I hope that it encourages you to be genuinely you. If you have faith in the Lord, if you've been impacted by the gospel, I hope you live that out. Well, God bless. Let's do this again. How about in a week? Ciao.